Welcome back, everybody, from lunch, and welcome to those of you watching us via Zoom. My name is Tim Campbell. I'm going to be moderating this, this panel for us this afternoon. We have three speakers. Up to this point, we've had two, but this panel, there will be three. But the format remains the same, roughly 30 minutes, and then 15 minutes of discussion immediately following the presentation. For those of you that are following us on Zoom, questions can be sent via chat. We've had that work quite well this morning. Our first presenter is Frank Kraushaar. He is from Riga up until recently. In 2020, he was at the University of Latvia. He is currently working on a project on neoclassicist cyber poetry in a Chinese context, a Chinese net. He's the author of numerous publications, but in the interest of, since we're starting a little late, I will send it forward to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Okay, I'll start right away. So this paper on disease, health, power, and trust as reflected in modern and classical Chinese poetry may also be considered an ethnological or anthropological approach to the problem of biopolitics and language in China and in Chinese societies, maybe in the way how Tim actually has suggested it yesterday. Having studied classical Chinese poetry for a long time, I just recently, a couple of years ago, got more interested in how it is adapted to and perceived in the contemporary world, the Chinese one and beyond. So today, I want to hint at a kind of biopolitics, not only ingrained with Chinese thought from its beginnings, but which also translates into modern ideology and affects the use of language in various ways. Intersections between poetry and politics in Chinese culture seem to be both more prominent, visible, and more subtle than in Western culture. In ancient and pre-modern China, lyrical poetry was considered the most refined literary art and a privilege of the political elite, the so-called scholar officials. Ancient, yet continuously upheld traditions of Chinese poetics emphasize two basic functions of poetry. A, to transform, hua, and B, to satirize, zi. These functions served to sustain a hierarchical social and stratified political order reflected in their complementary character. The sublime power of words to transform the world was on the side of those who took the upper ranks, whereas the dangerous liberty to satirize or criticize the powerful was on the side of those on lower, yet still respectable positions. But the overwhelming majority of non-allied folks in traditional China had no language at all. Through the revolutions of the 20th century, which sought to replace traditional dynastic sovereignty by democratic sovereignty, the character of poetic language radically changed, but the perception of those two basic functions and their importance for social and political communication did not. This sometimes is blurred by the often self-contradictory pathos of Chinese modernity and the propaganda myth suggesting that standards and rules in an age of cultural prosperity, shengshi, that is how the contemporary times are officially called in China, are not shaped by and conceptualized in support of a political elite, but rather the result of the Communist Party's thoughtful implementation of the people's needs and will. Thus, in his 2014 secret speech to the Beijing Forum on Literature and Art, Xi Jinping spoke of art as public service, which, quote, if the Marxist view of art and culture is firmly established, will make the people subject in artistic representation and emit the greatest positive energy, unquote. Now, the pandemic crisis and the party's totalitarian response that neglected accountability for its root causes while simultaneously declaring a total war, 从体战, on the virus, much accelerated CCP leadership's thrive on ideological and social mass mobilization. Within the same context, public discussion on health politics that in recent decades almost constantly ravaged the harmonic society in social and state media usually trigger poetic insertions of various purposes and of diverse quality. This paper attempts to shed light on the complexity of poetic, namely lyrical language, and biopower in the Chinese literary tradition and on its contemporary transition. At the beginning, I will briefly refer to related concepts of health, virtue, life, energy in canonical and traditional allied literature, and to elaborations on and carnivalizations of these values as accomplished by poets. I will basically quote one poet only, of pre-modern times. And afterwards, I will turn back to biopolitics and to the two basic functions of traditional Chinese poetry, to transform and to satirize, who served for ages the sustainability of pre-democratic hierarchies and in fact have maintained their ability to communicate trust. However, one of these functions now serves literary communities marginalized by a radically modernized version of biopower. In fact, the technically sophisticated idiom of classical Chinese, once the privilege of a ruling elite, now serves these hermetic, often virtual communities whose participants vary in character from formerly public intellectuals who now lost their positions in society. Gugong the Shifens, the actually public intellectual, has turned from a word of proud into a swear word over the last 10 years or so. Two self-educated cyber poets like Li Zi, whom I will later quote a poem, and occasional authors who in real life may even be low-ranking party officials. Vice versa, according to a Healthy China 2030 policy statement published recently on the WHO's website, quote, President Xi Jinping has put health at the center of the country's entire policy-making machinery, thus, unquote, thus seeking legitimacy for the party's democratic dictatorship by transforming a tradition once focused on rulers at the hierarchical summit of the power system into a Chinese modern rationality. So now let's very briefly turn to the pre-modern rationality. Here, well, I would focus on basically three or actually four terms that are important for us. In ancient China, and talking about ancient China, I of course mean the classics of the pre-Christian era that remained the reference sources for Chinese thinking and Chinese thinkers until the beginning of modern ages. A very central, if not the central notion, is the notion of de. So de actually results from transfusion of heavenly Tao, the principle of the world, actually, of everything, into a charismatic person or place, and renders the person or place invulnerable. De is sometimes translated as virtue, but it is actually not only moral virtue, it is moral and physical strength and invulnerability. Yeah? Then Yangsheng. Yangsheng is actually a method that, according to Taoist doctrine, must be trained by leading persons, by the rulers of states, even of families, in order to sustain their own body, their own body, to keep it functioning and to make it, in a way, an end in itself. And the final end of Yangsheng is to obtain longevity or even immortality. If you obtain this state, of your body and of your mind, you are ruling actually your family or even the world without interference, without doing anything. This is the principle of Wu Wei, which is so important in Chinese statecraft also. And the third term is qi, which would be translated as life energy, but it is also breath and vapor, weather, and can be pernicious or healthy, susceptible to outer manipulation or influence, and it requires, first of all, disciplined regulation. Okay, now I'm not going to go into detail, I'm not going to quote the Tao Te Ching chapter 51 line by line, it's not important. What I want to say here is that absolute power of rulership is not granted in traditional Chinese thought by a god, but it is achieved by the self-cultivation of the ruler who does it because he is a shangren, a wise person, and because of he is advised properly. Yeah? This is at the center of the Taoist part of, and the Taoist set of Chinese classical terms, but on the Confucian side, another aspect of the becomes more important, and that is the aspect and the question of how can we transmit the. So a ruler, well, obviously at a certain point has to die. So the question is how the next one, the successor, can sort of sustain the same de or accumulate the same quality of de and continue it. And that happens by imitation of models and by actually ritual conduct, proper ritual conduct, which is actually everything what Confucianism is about. And here I want to quote only one sentence, which is a very important, very central one, and is in the book of, or in the canon of rites, a Confucian classic of the 3rd century before the Common Era. And it goes, if you renewed yourself today, renew yourself every day, that each day may be a new one. And these characters are supposedly have been engraved into the bath tube of a mythical king of antiquity and become the motto for the daily conduct of any authoritative person. And what you see on the right side of the slide here is the same sentence on the cover page of one of the numerous volumes published by Xi Jinping, and which altogether comprise the complex set of ideological guidelines in China, which is called Xi Jinping Thought, and which has to be studied not only by every student, but also by every university teacher, by every CEO, by anyone who wants to advance, who wants to make a career. You need to know this, because you need how to speak in a proper way. We will turn back to this sentence in a while, so I leave out this poem here. So the healthy virtue of rulership must be imitated by successors in order to be transmitted and accumulated to prevent state and society from decay. But now let us first look at classical poetry to illustrate a more liberal attitude of creative poets toward the authority of absolute power and its healthy virtue, or so-called healthy virtue. With Du Fu, poet and perhaps the poet of the Chinese lyrical tradition of the 8th century of the Common Era, so with Du Fu's major verse, we arrive at a stage where the belief in a religious and political power that heals and safeguards the social organism of life transcends splendidly and with vigor to the aesthetic level. In Du Fu's late poems, written after the collapse of the Tang dynasty, during subsequent years of on the run and finally in the exile of a remote mountain area without hope for restoration of political authority, the diseases of his male body reverberate those of the body politic. Du Fu's incessant ailing is not merely a psychosomatic symptom of his private moral desperation. It is also depicted as the self-sacrifice of a loyal servant to a universal order of nature and cosmos, identical yet not coincidental with moral justice. Poems like the following clearly display an existential ambiguity, not devoid of a dry self-irony, that sees in the decay of nature the incurable disease of the organism of human community, and at the same time the unswerving truth of Tao obscured by time. And here the poem goes. The winds cut, clouds are high. Apes wail their sorrows. The air is fresh, sand wide. Birds fly in circles. On all sides fallen leaves go rustling, rustling, while ceaseless river waves come rippling, rippling. Autumn's each faded mile seems like my journey to mount alone and ill to this balcony. Life's failures and regrets frosting my temples, and wretched that I've had to give up drinking. So classical poets tell us of transcendental journeys in drunken stupor, regular hangovers, and even of the collapse of willpower as the paradoxical result of a frenzied desire for personal freedom and self-experience. Thus, they teach us the irony of being human instead of the fatal seriousness of cultivating one's authority and capacity to function in hierarchical positions of a morally sane human realm. In a sense, one could say perhaps they downgrade the myth of unswerving authority to a fable of human frailty. So now, the political and ideological claim of the Chinese party state to lead the healthy development of the Chinese nation into the process of a great post-20th century rejuvenation betrays a deeply rooted desire to overcome the painful and violent ruptures Chinese society has suffered at the hand of its modern authoritarian rulers. Xi Jinping's reference to King Tang's morning slogan mentioned above, if you renewed yourself today, renew yourself every day, that each day may be a new one, as a precept for continuity as progress, thus economic stability, state security, may be intentionally opposite to Lu Xun's, the great modernists and revolutionaries, iconic distortion of this Confucian dogma, which goes, if you renewed yourself day by day, then the ancients too wouldn't have to die. In fact, Lu Xun was very much convinced that the ancient had to die. To rescue Chinese society and culture from its deadly diseases, and he wasn't far away in his belief from Western modernists like Ezra Pound, who in ABC of Reading, 1934, noted the following. Oh, forgot some slides, sorry. Here it is. Language is the main means of human communication. If an animal's nervous system does not transmit sensations and stimuli, the animal atrophies. If a nation's literature declines, the nation's atrophies and decays. Here, the synthetic view on language interwoven with physical body and with social credit, comprising financial credit, suggests a dialectical tension between the human body as nervous system and society kept together by the credibility of words, which is the one that pervades Pound's poetics. Thus, power earns trusts, poetry spreads truth only under the myth of an authoritarian rule that battles the canker or the cancer of communication, which in Pound's world is usury, in order to restore healthy language. And it is needless to add here that Pound's avant-gardist Confucianism essentially was a self-eulogizing description of the fascist movement in Europe. In today's PRC, where any movement is soon brought under firm control of the party state, the useful animal called society must be prevented from atrophy, which is why, to repeat an earlier quote, President Xi Jinping has put health at the center of the country's entire policy-making machinery. That, of course, includes, if not presupposes, the regulation of the mainstream of public language. So let us now turn to the final poem. Actually, there were two poems, yeah. Now, both texts and their authors belong to a phenomenon I call neoclassicist cyber poetry in the China net. And this phenomenon first made appearance 2 decades ago almost simultaneously with the dynamic augmentation and fragmentation of digital public spaces. During an early stage, the impact on a poetry scene previously paralyzed by Tiananmen and the cultural commercialization that followed was described by one critic with that of a dosage of Viagra, lending to the synthesis of physical health poetry and its revitalized social and political function a somewhat ambiguous topicality. Howbeit, neoclassicist cyber poets make use of complex metrical forms, highly elusive vocabulary, and specific textual knowledge which with more or less virtuosity and more or less tend to fuse historical forms of grammar and style with contemporary slang or other mental characteristics and contents. The better and the best of them are keen and able to meet the sophisticated formal and stylistic requirements of a dead-allied poetry while writing completely new verse of postmodern hybridity. Both texts testify how the pandemic crisis boosted this way of writing. This already began during the earliest stages when the epidemic inflammation was discovered in Wuhan and whistleblowers like Li Wenliang and others were intimidated and persecuted by the authorities. But after the curfew of Wuhan, people in the city were banned for weeks from leaving their apartments, social media accounts censored and blocked for any expression of incorrect sentiment, while state media showered the general public day and night with news on battling frontline nurses and a food-providing scooter army. The short video you will watch in a moment went viral in spring 2020, posted and commented in the hundreds of thousands. It shows a girl in Wuhan whose mother had seriously fallen ill in her apartment prison. The first text part describes the scene as observed by sympathizing netizens. So now here we are. So you see now the video, and at the same time I'll read the first part, yeah? The gong-beating girl at home had no gong. To rescue her mum, shed floodwaves of tears, took a bowl for the gong and beat the blue sky, which neighbors around were unable to bear. The two subsequent The two subsequent text parts of the same poem report and comment on what followed. The outcry on social media would not wear off, but only grow. The video of forlorn desperation was stared at by a physically isolated and completely depoliticized public, like a mirror. And when finally the paramedical service arrived, the ailing mother was rescued last minute in a hospital nearby. This, however, wasn't the end, but only the beginning of the scandal that, in official media, was soon refabricated into a heroic victory of the party. Only a few days later, girl and mother gave several interviews broadcasted by state TV declaring that the mother's life and the family's happiness had been gloriously salvaged by the Communist Party, while their true savers who were unofficial cyber activists who had made sure the video couldn't be deleted by the censors from circulation, weren't worth a rush anymore. And on that background, you have to understand the last part. I'm just skipping the middle part of the poem. Being lucky oneself is rarely conferred. Our house blessing, therefore, is simply not yours. Shut all the doors to protect our safe lair. Humans aren't human, demons not demon. The gong-beating girl, now we laugh at her. Now the formerly sympathetic victims of power arrogance, and with them the phlegmatically conformist Chinese society of the new era, are spoofed for their lack of character. The disturbing logic of health biopolitics in the PRC, with its focus on healthy media contents and culture as public morality service, is satirized in the concluding verses. The gong-beating girl, now we laugh at her. Sudden reversion of sympathy into harsh sarcasm is a reaction symptomatic for the totalitarian assault on any spontaneous communication in the name of health and security. Now, the second and last poem is formally much more sophisticated and stylistically more elaborate. In comparison with the first one, it is more compact. Diction and imagery, line per line, involve several layers of meaning, including historical, literary allusion and sarcastic offenses of contemporary political authority resulting from ambiguous reading. The paratactic structure of the line pairs prevailing in most classical verse serves as basic element of an architecture of meaning which builds resistance against the same perversion of social trust claimed by a political power which is the well-known source of calamity. But it does so on a considerably higher level of reflection. The general suffering from unresisted fear of viral infection, hypocrisy, and interception of communication deemed destabilizing or undermining by the authorities is analyzed by exploring human mindscape via the classical opposition of seasonal and historical time. Screen touch, snow blowing, cherry blossoms everywhere, pale houses, darkening lights, and sighs so deep and long. Constraints broken alone by spring, mighty and vast. Speech hoarded well, forlorn one sits by midnight dull and strong. An orphaned city, poisoned prey, ails between life and death, remains, burn all the books, a place of grief and song. The warning written stays, although the whistling trails off. Rely only on daily notes, keep reading well, fang fang. I'm coming to an end. Closely summarizing the poem, briefly summarizing the poem. The author Lizi comments an acute state of emergency and its human misery by elaborating on basic aesthetics of classical poetry. The season of the cherry blossoms reduced to a virtual screen spectacle. Pale houses apparently lifeless, though full of locked-in inhabitants. The chasm in the symbiosis of nature's and humans' daily life dominate the first half, while the second shifts focus to the city of Wuhan taken as a prey by an alien power, which is, of course, Wuhan is a southern city and the alien power is Beijing. In the Chinese mind, that's quite clear. History here appears in two contrary qualities, as time disposed on by a central state power, which from its origins always has resorted to violent control of communication. Burn all the books, that of course refers to the book burning of Qin Shi Huangdi in 216 before the Common Era. And as vernacular narrative of unfaltering regional self-assurance, by letting the poem end on the rhyming name of the Wuhan prose writer Fang Fang, who earned herself fame and later patriotic disdain with her digital Wuhan diary, The author of the poem, who also is a local resident, creates a strong sense of identity that resists party despotism. Therefore, after several years of research on this field, I'm quite convinced that the language of classical poetry, transmitted, cleared by reification, and thus democratically transformed within a new communicational context, gives some immunity to creative minds against the party state's emission of greatest positive energy, through a cultural industry officially regarded and functionalized as public health service. It also seems to function as exclusive idiom which aesthetically encloses the pandemic event, saving the liberty to comment on and satirize it from multiple perspectives. It won't, however, be sufficient, I'm afraid, to prevent PRC society from becoming the next human prey in the world history of totalitarianism. Thank you. Before you try to find your questions, this poem, just a second, is also has been made into a video. That is a very common thing among the cyber poets. They write text, and when they become popular, they make a short video out of it. That's 1 minute. The last was, of course, the text in the calligraphy of the author.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we have 15 minutes for questions. Sure, Marco.
Thank you very much. It's always fascinating to get an insight into culture with which at least I am not very familiar. First question, which is quite evident to me, is how do the authorities in China react to such poetry, which is quite openly critical? I mean, I wasn't aware of a lot of leeway in that respect, but yeah, how can you explain that is possible now?
Yeah. Well, censorship and public control do not function anymore as they used to under Soviet rule or during Maoist times. So now the crucial question whether how to react from the side of the authorities is not the content of something being said or being shown, but it is the quantity of followers. And that's about mainstream control. And so that brings us to the particular object of this talk, actually. Neoclassicist cyber poetry is written in a language that is modern, but it relies on this not only on the structure, but also on the words of classical Chinese. And you can read these texts only if you have studied the classical language. So automatically, if you want so, the community that gathers around the cyber poets, the communities gathering around the cyber poets are very small. And that is why censors are not interested. However, as I said, I've studied that now for 4 years, and I know many of them, and there is even an anthology of cyber poets from 2011, and not a single author neither the anthology itself had been allowed to be published in print. So.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and I am not, of course, I am absolutely ignorant in, in Chinese poetry, but for me it was very interesting that it resonates with what we know very well here, with strategies to elude censorship in the Soviet Union, what you call, for instance, Aesopian language, and so the fact that you have hints to things, but they are hidden into a text which otherwise is okay. And the other is Samizdat, of course, which is exactly the small community of people where some kind of underground poetry or every kind of written text is circulating, and so it's very small. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That was my question. So, because in the Soviet Union it was underground, it was so typewritten. Sometimes you could also have some kind of readings, people gathering, having readings of these poems. But now it's the social media, I guess, and in the social media, you can have a very small group, but then exactly the likes can become very relevant and a lot. Or are these groups closed or open? And so the authorities, they don't have any access to it.
Such poems are mainly communicated over Weibo, which is like, or WeChat, which is like, what is the European equivalent for that? Twitter. And these Twitter accounts, like for example the Wuhan Diary by Fang Fang, which has been translated into German also and published June last year, it was immediately the Twitter account was shut down because she had so many followers, but she had a second Twitter account which was not immediately shut down, and then she continued to publish a page every day. And the page was then by her followers within seconds. It was copied and transformed into such text, which is actually the text Fang Fang wrote. But here you have it, for example, in the calligraphy of Mao Zedong. You have it on a print plate of the Sung dynasty, 11th century. Here you have it in Tibetan. Here you have it with that and that. So that is when that confuses the algorithms. Yeah? And then the game starts. Yeah? But with the poets themselves, I would say, well, yes, of course, they sometimes also publish on huge forums, and these forums from time to time are shut down, and then they undergo a medical treatment. So certain texts disappear, yeah? And then they are opened again after a year or after two, and then you look what is still in there and if it's worth to publish there or not. Yeah, but in general, as I said, these texts are difficult to understand, so not for people who are in classical Chinese, but for anyone else. And so the authorities rather think that, okay, let them play their games. As long as it has no drive, then it doesn't matter. Yeah, but they're still watching.
Other questions? Great. I have a question. A couple of questions, actually. I was really curious and heartened to hear you at the end of your paper speak about immunity. That the language, I don't have it exactly down, but the language of classical poetry, democratically rendered, was immunizing, I think is the word used, which is a nice bridge to our next paper. But could you say a little bit more about that? Sort of this idea that the poetry itself, the poetry that you're discussing, it functions as a kind of, as an immunizing force against this, the constant application to be kind of follow this rule, or to be healthy, or to wait to renew yourself is the phrase you used.
Yes, well, okay, thank you for the question. That is actually the thing I'm still trying to explore more and more. And after I've basically finished a book on Lietz, I'm going to continue at least for a couple of years in order to look at more of those poems. And this is exactly what I'm interested in. But so as far as I'm now, I can say that the immunizing effect comes from, or basically is in the clarity of mind a writer can keep while he writes in the classical language, because his mind is not affected by the virus of conformity, which is really, conformity is absolutely viral in Chinese society. As I mentioned this Tianghuo app, I didn't, but I talked about Xi Jinping talk, and the Tianghuo app means it's an application, as I said, everybody has to download it. And you are even checked by, it's registered how often you go into this app and learn Xi Jinping thought. You know, it's viral. And if you use this language, and if you even know how to use the language in order to write modern poetry, which is only the case with some people, then I would call this a certain immunity against this virus. Yeah.
Sorry, that's great. We still have 3 minutes or so. Another question? Yeah.
Simply something it's really interesting. Peter Torup from Vince University used the expression dissimulation in assimilation. Peter Torup, a semiotician and a very well-known scholar at Vince University, he used the expression dissimulation in assimilation. So referring once again to to the Soviet way of doing it. That you must match, so to say, the requirement, but when matching the requirement, you can use this matching in order to make some points which are not quite the right ones, so that you dissimulate by assimilating. It's a kind of paradoxical, but still it works well, and I think it works well. It works well also for this relation between the virus and the immunities. Yeah. You have to have a virus in order to develop immunity, or you can be immune by exploiting the virus, so to say.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I put it down, the dissimulation and assimilation. It's exactly what's happening. So you find classicist poems on Tiananmen, on the Cultural Revolution, on all kinds of issues they're not able to talk about in plain language.
Thank you. Frank, a round of applause.
Thanks.